This video may be the bookend or final part to a series of videos, both consisting of me directly debating communists, left-wing extremists, and some of them being my reflections on and analysis of responses to those discussions a little bit more indirectly. It's definitely not a type of content I want to keep making forever and ever, in part because most of those people come to the discussions with the conviction that they have absolutely nothing to learn from the interaction. For the most part, they feel like those conversations are just an opportunity for them to demonstrate how committed they are to the cause. And so it's ultimately kind of futile and frankly depressing. And not all debates are like that. I really noticed the difference lately when I've debated with people who are conservatives or right-wingers. I notice that they all respect book learning on my part when it's demonstrated. So I was talking to a right-winger, and he mentioned something from a particular book by Aristotle. And I said to him, that is interesting, but there's this other book by Aristotle that discusses it from a different angle. Have you also looked at that? He said, oh no, he hadn't read that. And right away, the way he responded to me, the way he interacted with me changed. Where he, even though he and I disagreed about politics, I was far to the left of him, but nevertheless, he could recognize, okay, I've done this reading, I know something about this, and he was going to respect my opinion, even if only provisionally. He was going to be interested in what I had to say on the basis of having read that book, and the kind of conversation could proceed in a respectful way from there. In talking to the far left-wingers, by the contrast, they come into the conversation with the attitude, you can't teach me nothing. They'll deny that you've done any reading. If you've read something, they'll claim you haven't really read it. They'll claim you don't know what you're talking about. They'll insist that you haven't read Karl Marx when you have or whatever. And even when you catch them on historical facts or, when it's obvious you know something they don't know, they'll never have a kind of humble and appreciative attitude of like, oh, okay, thanks. You taught me something or reminded me of something I didn't know or hadn't thought of for years. I've gotten absolutely no positive appreciation from the far left that way, which I have gotten from conservatives and the far right. Even though in some ways the difference between me and a conservative might be more difficult to negotiate. So with all that been said, today I had a really interesting and really rewarding conversation with a far left winger, and there were other people in the room. I was at the gym lifting weights, so for a large part of the conversation I just listened as there was this sort of Socratic dialogue addressed to the question of what is the meaning of exploitation from this kind of far left perspective. So it's an interesting problem. A lot of people on the far left, and this is really how this part of the conversation began, a lot of people on the far left use the word exploitation in such a broad sense that any employment is exploitation. So there's this long Socratic dialogue getting at, look, if one man owns a lemon tree and grows the lemons and makes it into lemonade, is that exploitation? He's doing it all himself. It's one man who owns one lemon tree and owns a lemonade stand and owns a lemonade press. Do you consider that exploitation? And then this sort of long sequence of questions to get down to the root of what is it you define as exploitation, and what is it that you are really promising when you say that the end of capitalism will mean the end of exploitation, the end of the exploitation of man by man. So the particular guy this debate happened with, the particular representative of socialism and to some extent communism, he's not a typical communist. He was really aware of the extent to which communism tends to make misleading promises by saying that they will take away private property ownership from the millionaire class, from the aristocrats, from the plutocrats, from the capitalist elite, whatever you want to say. He's aware of the extent to which there's a misleading promise that communists will take away that ownership and then give it to the people. But in reality, the people means the state, the government, that basically a government bureaucracy or even a military dictatorship, some kind of totalitarian regime, takes over the role of the owners and the managers of what used to be free enterprise, private industry. So he was really aware of that, and that was not the model of communism that he endorsed or the model of socialism that he endorsed. Because the guy was to some extent a communist, to some extent a socialist. What he defended was exclusively the replacement of capitalist ownership, capitalist investment even, the replacement of that with co-op ownership. Cooperative, so workers' co-ops, workers' cooperatives. Okay. So this led to a really interesting little dialogue between him and I. I mean, again, a lot of this conversation, I was just lifting weights at the gym, was listening in. I occasionally put in a word or two. Then at this point, I really stepped in and said, okay, well, now I'm interested. I'm interested in challenging you a bit or disambiguating what your position is. And I said to him the following, okay, when you look at a co-op grocery store and a private sector corporate-owned grocery store, because that's a real-world example a lot of us know. Maybe in the city you're living in, there are co-op grocery stores. What is the difference? Now, I'm not claiming there's no difference, but you have to admit, for you as a customer, if you go into a co-op, cooperatively owned, workers' co-op owned grocery store, the prices are maybe 10% higher, and the salaries paid to the workers are maybe 5% higher. And the variety, the selection of products on offer is narrower. There are fewer different boxes of cereal. There, especially with fresh fruits, with things that go bad, that have a short. The co-op has to manage things more tightly. So, all right, there are some differences. But the difference between doing my grocery shopping at a co-op and doing my grocery shopping at a for-profit, corporate-owned grocery store, it's really not that dramatic. And especially if you compare many of them, some corporate-owned grocery stores, some are better than others, to make a long story short. I mean, where I was in Victoria, Canada, there was one chain, and they were really open about the fact that even though they were a corporate, for-profit corporation, they had this charter, this constitution, where they were really committed to paying good wages to their employees and to having low prices for their customers. They had this sort of, set of guidelines. And I met and spoke to people who had been employed by more than one grocery store, and they said, yeah, there's a real difference. These guys treat their employees differently from those guys. A lot of sectors of the economy look at that. So the point being, there isn't some kind of simple, stark contrast between a co-op owned business and and the private for-profit owned business. Now, this is following up on something I discussed in an earlier video here. If you look at, so an example might be a university. If you look at a public university, a government-owned university, and you look at a private for-profit university, there are some differences. But we don't see in that contrast the sort of night and day difference that communists seem to be promising when they talk about abolishing man's exploitation of man, that somehow, capitalism, with the end of capitalism, there will be this tremendous emancipation, the start of a new era. Like if you say, okay, so if what you guys are promising is you're going to go to all the private for-profit universities and colleges and shut them down and have the government take them over, and then the government will run those universities like the public sector universities. So the universities, so some universities we already have in the West are run by the government, some are not. That's not really going to be liberation. There will be some differences. Probably, tuition's going to be a little bit lower, and maybe the salaries for professors are going to be a little bit higher, and you can look at some of the differences when you compare, like in the United States, a state-owned college versus kind of Ivy League college, and maybe there will be less money wasted on lavish football stadiums or something. There's some differences. But I mean, a great example in the United States of America, look at Navy University. When the U.S. military runs a university, that's a 100% government-run thing, and the budget is completely provided by taxpayers, I think they still have a football team and a basketball team and stuff. But sure, there's a difference between U.S. Navy University and Yale or some of these Ivy League endowment-based. Okay, there's some differences. Another difference about the university would be the role of donors, the role of soliciting donations and patronage. Okay, there are some differences, but we're not looking at a stark difference here between the exploitation of man and this new era, this new epoch of the exploitation of man. Now, by contrast, if you look back in history, not just in North America, not just in Europe, if you compare the epoch of slavery to the abolition of slavery, it's a huge fundamental change in society. There's a much understudied history of the abolition of slavery in China, by the way. I think there is no good book in English. I think there's never been a book in English, well-written, well-researched, really dealing with how China abolished slavery. Fascinating history. And everything changed. Everything fundamentally changed in people's lives with the emancipation of the slaves, the abolition of slavery. So that's a big, huge change in society. It's like, okay, but you look around. I gave all kinds of examples in my other videos. But you say, okay, so this is what this type of business is like when it's run by the government, whether it's a prison or, whatever. And, this is what it's like when a private sector contractor takes it over. Okay, so this is what a public swimming pool is like when it's owned by the government and run on a kind of non-profit, government, taxpayer-funded basis. And this is a public swimming pool when it's a for-profit corporation. Okay, there are differences. There are advantages and disadvantages. But this is not the kind of epoch-making transition people seem to be talking about. And now in this specific dialogue with this guy, we're getting even more specific and even more narrow because we're not dealing with public sector versus private sector. He's very narrowly endorsing a switch from corporate-owned, capitalist-owned, to a paradigm of co-op, workers' co-op-owned businesses. And I threw out some different examples of workers' co-ops. Another guy in the call threw out the example of co-op dairy farming. It's a great example. So, in New Zealand, they have this history of workers' co-op dairy farms. And guess what? You look at the workers' co-op dairy farms, you look at everything, how the animals are treated, exploitation of the animals, exploitation of the laborers, ecological impacts, environmental impact. You can look at that, and then you can look at a for-profit corporation and how it runs a dairy farm. It's like, okay, I'm not saying there are zero differences here, but this is a pretty slight difference we're looking at. The difference between corporate ownership and the co-op ownership. So the main example I discussed at length, and probably in the city where you live, you've seen this, is the difference between a private for-profit taxi company, so a corporation, let's say, that owns taxis and then employs people as taxi drivers, compared to a workers' co-op taxi company. That's very common. Many cities, at least in Canada and the United States, they have a co-op taxi company. Now, from the customer's perspective, there is no visible difference whatsoever. And if you look into it from the employee's perspective, is there maybe a 5% difference? So we talked about that example at some length. And I said to him, okay, so what your whole theory comes down to is this. His perspective was, if a company is earning a 5% profit, then that 5% is a fundamental injustice. And if they make a transition to a workers' co-op based model, where everything's the same, except that 5% gets redistributed to the workers, or not even redistributed, it's handed out to the workers as a bonus at the end of the year, then that's this paradise. That's the workers' paradise. It's the 5% difference. The puny difference you see between going to a Whole Foods, a for-profit corporation grocery store, and going to a workers' co-op grocery store, that's the difference he wants to achieve throughout society. Now, I very briefly said to him, okay, look, you know what? It's a difference. The difference of whether the profits are shared by the employees on a workers' co-op basis as opposed to the profits being concentrated in the hands of the owners or the hands of the executives or whatever the situation is with this corporation. But then you have to recognize also, when you concentrate profits in the hands of the owners, they have the opportunity to take those profits and put it into research and development. They can take those profits and invest it in buying new machinery. They can take those profits and invest it in advertising. There are actually big fundamental advantages to the profits being held onto, whether that's 5% or 7% or 10%. I've been told most grocery stores operate with a 2% profit margin. I think they turn over a lot of money, but still they hold on to a pretty small margin in terms of profitability. So, but if you take that away from the grocery store, obviously the grocery store, for example, has no budget for advertising anymore. They have no budget for innovation or making investment in new equipment and new things. So when you just space this out over the medium term, when you're just looking at 10 years or 20 years, you can see a lot of disadvantages. But even more short term than that, and this came up with the example of the co-op, the dairy co-op. I notice you presume that there's a 5% profit to be shared. What happens when it's a 5% loss? It's a lot harder for a workers' co-op to endure when you have the kinds of challenges that are inevitable, not just in capitalism, but in real life, when there are winners and losers, when risks get taken, and when sometimes at the end of the year, it's not that you're handing out a bonus. Do you really think that the taxi company can look at the taxi drivers and say, hey guys, we need to take some of your money away, because this year, it's not a profit at all, we're in the red. In conclusion, I said this to the guy in the conversation too. When communists talk about ending the exploitation of man by man, when they make these promises of a new epoch, of a new era, they do so with pointedly vague phrases, especially phrases surrounding the painfully vague concept of exploitation. They do so by vilifying profit itself, by vilifying capitalist ownership itself. But if you can talk to someone on the far left who was as honest as this guy, if you can move past those vague, exaggerated histrionic claims, all it is they're really promising is something like a 5% difference, a difference that really cannot justify a revolution.